A very good explanation of how we finance education. Most of you don't know, unless you've been on the school board perhaps, or served in the Senate, because our system is very complex. I'm going to try and give you a fast trip through it, which you won't fully understand, but at least to give you sort of an orientation. The Brigham Rule, dictated by the Supreme Court in 1996, required that substantially equal education tax resources in every school district. The appeal of the plaintiffs in that case was that districts like Stowe and Killington and Woodstock had huge, and Stratton in particular, ski area, no people, had huge tax base per pupil. Towns like Hardwick and Brownington and Stannard, were the three lowest, had lots of pupils and no tax base. And this imbalance was the rallying cry for years for politicians that wanted to somehow get their hands on the tax base of the so-called gold towns, take it to Montpelier and send it out the door to so-called poor towns. Those of us who were part of this for 30 years, and I was, had to radically reorient our thinking, because up to that time, with the Simpson formula, the Morse-Giuliani formula, the Miller formula, the Foundation Plan, the previous state aid versions, the state, out of its general fund, paid money out to poor town schools. In fact, we even gave a little bit out to rich town schools just so they could say they got some money to their voters. Well, the Brigham Rule stood everything on its head by requiring that somehow the tax bases be rationalized or harmonized, if you will. So Act 60 of 1997 created the Shark Pool, called the Sharing Pool, widely known as the Shark Pool, where all the money from going out to the various towns and coming in from the various towns went into the pool and was shuffled out to satisfy the Brigham Rule. Well, if you remember back in 1998, 9, 2000, there was a huge resistance movement among the richer towns directed at the Shark Pool. In 2003, the Republican House created Act 68, which cleverly did away with the Shark Pool without doing away with the Brigham Rule. And at the time, I remember Shumlin taking some credit for that. I remember writing a letter to the Free Press saying, yeah, that's exactly the way it works and it's clever, but just bear in mind that we didn't scrap the Brigham Rule, which was invented out of whole cloth by Justice Dooley on the Supreme Court. It's still there. It's now organized in a way that you can't see it anymore. So I'm going to try and help you see how this works. It works, number one, school board makes up a budget. Number two, it tells the voters, it puts it before the voters. Number three, the voters approve it, eventually. Okay, now you have, after all the school boards, after all the voters have acted, you can now take your calculator and add up all the school budgets and figure out the bottom line for education spending in public schools in the state. It's not at the whim of the state, it's at the whim of the voters in 256 districts. Okay, the education fund established by Act 60 must pay those budgets. If a town says that $1 million, voters vote $1 million for education, or $10 million, the education fund must pay the $10 million. And it will get back in 3 payments over the course of the year what the voters voted for. There's no state control over the voters. Okay, this is an Achilles heel for this system in the view of Howard Dean, Jim Douglas, and Peter Shumlin. Anybody in the government understands that how much the education fund has to pay out depends on somebody else's decisions, lots of people's decisions. Education fund sources, where the money comes from. General fund transfer was a part of the compromise of Act 60, currently $295 million. shipped from the general fund budget of the state into the education fund. That's sort of a leftover from previous state aid formulas under the foundation plan. The non-homestead property tax, which is second homes, businesses, empty land, bring $595 million. The homestead property tax, $580 million. Sales and motor vehicle purchase taxes, $160. Lottery profits, miscellaneous, comes out to $1.5 billion. Now, how do you determine the property tax rate for homesteads? This is a house and 2 acres. Well, for non-residential property, the state legislature sets the rate. It's $1.515, $1.51.5 per $100 of fair market value, decreed by the legislature. The legislature also picks the base rate for homestead residential tax. But the actual rate that you pay in your town depends on how much above the base education amount, which is set by the legislature, you spend per pupil. There were, a couple of years ago, there were 4 towns in the state that were still paying only the basic education amount, which was then something like $9,250. Okay, those towns paid 94 cents, just been raised to 98 cents this year, because there was no adjustment. But for the great bulk of towns, and certainly everyone that's represented here tonight, the more you spend per pupil in your school budget, the more you will pay in your residential property tax rate. In fact, when you get to 125% of the state average, you get a penalty on top of that to discourage you from continuing to spend. We have the property tax adjustment. Taxpayers with household incomes below around $90,000 can pay their homestead school property tax with 1.8% of their incomes. So they get a bill for $5,000. If 1.8% of their incomes is $4,000, they pay $4,000. And there's an interfund transfer that makes up the missing $1,000. 70% of people who file Vermont taxes, who have homesteads, are on this system. So those 70% of taxpayers are going to pay 1.8% of their income, and they don't care what the property tax rate is, because they're not going to pay it. They're going to pay something based on your income tax rate. And this is a political reality that the 30% who have to actually pay the calculated property tax rate are always going to be outvoted by the 70% that don't. There are other factors involved, but that's a major part of it. So the people who are on this system don't care what the rates are. $158 million to cover that shortfall in the coming year. Okay, here's how you compute the homestead property tax rate. The base rate this year is 98 cents per $100 fair market value. It's increased by the percent that local spending per ADM, which is average daily membership, a pupil count, although it's a weighted pupil count, exceeds the state basic education amount, which is now $9,285. So the point here is that as your spending per pupil rises above the magic number that the state put in the law, your property tax rate for homestead tax will follow that hand in hand, increase, to create voter resistance. So they'll stop spending. An example, district votes 11,820 per ADM. That's 20% higher than the 9285. So your local homestead tax rate is 120% of 98, or $1.17.6. That's fairly straightforward, but the point I want to emphasize is there is no state aid payment to anybody anymore. After Act 68, that became a historical artifact. All of the payments we argued over for 40 years are not there. The pupil count. Vermont's public school pupils peaked at 106,000 in 1997 when Act 60 was passed. It count has now dropped down to 88,000 in 2014. That's a steady decrease of 1,000 a year, more or less. The spending per pupil has increased from 10,888 in 1997 to 17,700 in 2011, and more than that now, of course, in 3 more years. That's inflation adjusted. This is not the government cheapening our dollars. Well, Lord knows they are. But it's a real increase, even as the number of pupils exhibits a real decrease. This is a really embarrassing, should be an embarrassing fact. Here's a spending comparison chart. The per pupil spending is the black line in the middle. Is that the color? Yeah. The 2 lower lines are the Consumer Price Index and median family income, tracked pretty carefully. Per pupil spending is rising far faster than that, and health spending is even faster than that. Why? Low pupil to teacher ratio. We're the second lowest in the United States. We're about 11 pupils per 1 teacher. Other states are in the nation, the national average is about 16. That may not seem like a lot, but you multiply that by the number of kids, and you got enormous amount of cost per pupil. And if you, Art Wolf did some calculations, if we just had the U.S. average, he calculated we saved $230 million the first year. This is like 5 or 6 years ago. Low pupil to staff ratio. Vermont has very high non-teaching staff ratio. Eagle. What's happening?
For some reason you wanted to shut off.
Yeah. Only a couple slides in here.
Saving electricity.
Have to with all the high price electricity Sheldon's forcing them to buy. So the bottom line here is that we have very few pupils per teacher and very few pupils per staff member. This is cafeteria workers, bus drivers, coaches, counselors, and so on. This is very personnel heavy compared to other states. Part of that is because we're dispersed. We don't have the population density. We have lots of little schools. Nobody wants to go an hour on the bus like you do in Montana. Sometimes 2 hours on the bus in Montana to get to school. We have a large bureaucracy from Montpelier all the way down through the superintendents. We have a especially large special ed bureaucracy, which is a federal mandate that the feds never got around to paying for, but they made it a right that can be sued for. And every parent that feels his kid is not getting free and appropriate services will go to court or can go to court and demand that the services be provided. And I know many cases where the school district said, okay, rather than fight this thing out from Superior Court and then an appeal court, or to state the Supreme Court, hell, we'll just pay it. Maybe the kid will go away after a couple of years. But not only is it costly to prosecute, to defend the cases, but it eats up the superintendent's time and energy. And it's just a curse, really, for school districts. Increased state and federal requirements, most recently Common Core, but there have been all kinds of things that have come down the pipe. If you look at the Title 16 of the Vermont Code, you'll see a whole bunch of requirements that were put in there probably in World War I about patriotic observances. And that's not too burdensome. But the legislature has had a bad habit on one hand of saying no mandates, unfunded mandates, but on the other hand, agreeing to one more thing the schools need to do. And the school people will say to you, you grew up in a time when you went to school to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a few more things. Nowadays, the school is your parent away from home, taking care of your social, nutritional, and psychological problems, and physical problems, lunch programs, that in your day, John, were not any business with the school at all. And we have actually, the society expects somebody to do this, and since we have custody of your kid, we're the people that end up getting stuck with it, and that's a telling point, and they're right. High fixed costs for underutilized buildings, with the population in the schools dropping. You have half-full classrooms in places. We're overbuilt. You know, we were built for 108,000 15 years ago, and now we're overbuilt for 88,000. That's one of the big costs. And of course, healthcare costs. Health insurance costs have gone up, as that chart showed you, much faster than education costs and incomes. Not pension costs. Teachers' pensions are paid for by the state. They're not paid for by your school's budget. This was a deal that was made back in the 1950s or 40s when it was not possible to give out state aid to low-cost school districts. But the legislature at the time said, "We'll tell you what, we'll take off your back the cost of pensions for your teachers," which of course wasn't much in those days, and no health benefits in those days. So nowadays it's become, I came out of an hour-and-a-half meeting in Secretary Spaulding's office this afternoon about the Vermont State Teachers Retirement System, and the $28 million that is being snatched out of it every year to pay for the health care benefits for retired teachers. Everybody knows we shouldn't be doing this, we can't keep on doing this, and Treasurer Pearson, Secretary Spaulding, who was Treasurer before, are really trying to get out of this, but the money has to come from somewhere, and every somewhere has its defender. So they made some progress, and I really believe they're totally committed to it, but we still got a long way to go. One current solution that's hot right now is a response to the taxpayer outrage at school property tax costs, homestead property tax. The education fraternity is not going to restructure education in any way that diminishes the perquisites and opportunities of the people in the system. But they feel like that people are yelling about property tax and voting down school budgets. I think 34 were voted down this year. The education establishment came up with a hoary old chestnut that has been around since 1892, if you want to go back that far, namely consolidation. The law now provides for regional education districts. There was one agreed to in Addison, and the voters repealed it. There was one attempted in Westford and failed. Voters don't want to organize their local school out of existence. The fact that North Bennington Village School went private was to avoid being swallowed up in a regional education district by the town of Bennington, which had the population density in the schools. And clearly, the cost containment would say, all right, close the village school in North Bennington. It's an outlier, and we can just bus them 8 miles down to Bennington and use all that extra space and save a lot of money. So, to their credit, the North Bennington Village School Board, Public School Board, said, we're doomed if we stick in this system. We got to get the hell out. And they did it by closing the school and by tuitioning all their kids to public or private independent schools. And they created, and it was a little bit awkward, because the school board essentially created the independent school to receive the kids who have been going to the village school. All in all, this is a great idea, but there was a little bit of self-dealing involved that's caused a lot of criticism. However, they did get away with it. The legislature has now passed a 2-year moratorium, but they didn't pass. That failed. It almost passed. To keep anybody from doing what North Bennington did until the education establishment could find some way to make it completely impossible. And that will be a high agenda item in the next legislature. I'm sure Rob will have more to say about that. The regional, the voluntary consolidation nobody took up the offer. There were incentives, but it wasn't selling. Eventually, Secretary Villaseca, now happily departed, at least departed from the Department of Education, Agency of Education, was very frank in saying that if they won't do it, I'm going to order them to do it. I want you to give me the authority. Well, even the liberal legislature gagged on that one. But eventually that'll come back, because towns won't want to do this, and the only way they can make them do it is by forcing them to do it in some way not entirely clear at this point, but machinery is there to do it. They assumed that reorganization would close smaller schools, save money, administrative efficiency. However, you get greater transportation costs. The all kids at a centralized school. Superintendent staffs will mushroom. You may get 3 or 4 superintendent districts organized in one new regional education district, in which case you'll have a superintendent and 3 assistant superintendents, and then deputy assistant superintendents and auxiliary superintendents. And, this is the way government bureaucracies proliferate. So whatever they say on day 1, by day 5, it's going to look quite a bit different over time. And here's the key point about these districts. There's no political accountability for the regional economic education district. Okay, think waste management district. Okay, Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District, 51 towns belong to it. Who's on the board? I don't know. I doubt if any of you know, unless you happen to be on the board. Now, we don't know what it does, but we know the trash goes somewhere. And we're pretty well content that it disappear and that there be some funding for it. But the regional education district will impose the waste management district model on education, which people are a great deal more concerned about than they are about what happens to the trash. Ideally, you would have a political body that has accountability to its citizens and runs the schools. What you will have here is a political body which does not have accountability to anybody, except when they approve the regional district budget. It'll be made up of, let's say, 8 little towns. The people in those towns don't know the people in the other towns. There's no coherent political body corresponding to the district, just like a waste management district. And this, I think, is absolutely fatal to the idea of democratic self-government. Real solutions: let money follow the child. Pupils can choose to attend lower-cost schools they prefer, universal school choice. Move to parental choice and provider competition. Make public schools compete for pupils instead of coercing their revenues from the voters. And consider educational freedom districts. The bill will be promoted back in the 1990s. Howard Crawford Burke was our lead sponsor. To give every district a chance to merge with other districts, create charter schools, create voucher programs, do all kinds of things that would leave them in charge of their local education, but not the model that the state imposes on them. And this would, I think, stimulate a great deal of creativity and citizen involvement, which is exactly what you would want for our public school system. This is the completely out-of-the-box solution in Montpelier, however. The Montpelier solution is we're going to have a top-down bureaucracy. The money will flow into the education fund from all these tax sources. It'll be used to pay off the budgets voted by the local taxpayers. And over time, will there be some strings attached? You may not get the budget that you voted because the state is penalizing you for spending too much on A, B, C, or D. And you're going to have sort of the equivalent of Green Mountain Care, namely a system run by the government at the high level, not by government in your town or school district. These are real solutions, are tough to campaign on in any specifics because it's a very complicated subject, but it's still, I think, the only way out of this. And one of the resources on that sheet that you have is our 2009 report, Better Education, Fewer Taxpayer Dollars, which which explains just how that would work and how much money the state taxpayers would save if only 20% bailed out of the public school system. Once you have, I did a column a couple weeks ago, you might have seen, on the DC charter school competition with the DC public schools. My grandson's in the charter school in the district. And typically the union and the school boards really don't want charter schools. They don't want anything except traditional schools with unionized teachers. Well, they had some reformers in the District of Columbia School District office who made it easy to create charter schools. There's now, I believe, 107 traditional public schools and 104 charter schools. Some primary, some secondary, some special purpose. And now what you're seeing after 3 or 4 years of this, you're seeing some charter schools that fail because they're badly managed and not producing a product, and people won't send their kids there, so they're shut down. When's the last time you saw a public school shut down for failing? Well, Winhall. It's the only one I know in my 40 years. Another story. But what's happening in the district is that public schools are sidling up, troubled public schools are sidling up to successful charter schools nearby to join forces to lift their status, which is exactly what you want. You want the genius of enterprise and freedom to make new arrangements, try new things, see what works somewhere else, implement it here, and that's kind of an environment that we should be creating everywhere. But you can't do it when all the public schools are being fed out of the faucet that comes from the taxpayer squeezed up above by a state government system like Act 68. Okay, questions for me on that subject?